So I'm Anne-Laure, and I'm absolutely thrilled to welcome you to this thought leader session today with Professor Rita McGrath on Headlines from the Future. But before we start, I would like to introduce Professor Rita McGrath. Professor McGrath is undeniably one of the most influential contemporary scholars and thought leaders in the field of innovation and strategy. Rita is a best-selling author, a sought-after speaker, and a longtime professor at Columbia Business School. She is one of the world's top experts on innovation and growth, and is one of the most regularly published authors in HBR. She is consistently ranked among the top 10 management thinkers in the world and was ranked #1 for strategy by Thinkers 50. She also writes a lot of books, including a bestseller entitled The End of Competitive Advantage, and Discovery-Driven Growth, a breakthrough process to reduce risk and seize opportunity, which has been praised as one of the most important management ideas ever developed by scholar Clayton Christensen. Her latest book is Seeing Around the Corners, How to Spot Inflection Points in Business Before They Happen, and I'm sure this will serve as a basis for our talk today. Rita, it's a great honor to have you here with us today in the ISPIM community, and over to you for the next 20 minutes.
Oh, thank you so much, Anne-Laure. It's a pleasure to be here. So let me make sure I've got everything working, and then just trying to get it to full screen. I can never decide which sequence to do this in. All right, so share screen. Here we go.
Perfect timing. We've got 110 people joining so far.
Oh, lovely. Okay, so you should be able to see my screen now?
Yes.
Perfect. So we'll go into full screen. There we go. So a pleasure to be here. Thank you for inviting me. And what I thought I'd do is present about 20 minutes worth of material from the new book, but updated to reflect our current circumstances, which I think is what people are really interested in. I get a lot of questions about, how do we think about these times of such vast uncertainty? So the core idea behind the book is that we are all dealing with inflection points. And a strategic inflection point was really made popular by Andy Grove some years ago. And he said what it does is it causes the assumptions underlying your business to fundamentally change. In other words, the rules of success that were at one point valid become less and less true. And of course, with COVID-19, with protests for justice all over the world, with what's going on right now, clearly a lot of the assumptions we were all making about what would be true have, within a breathtakingly short period of time, become undone. And so the challenge before us is really, how do we think about moving forward? And I would suggest it's a real kind of learning moment for many of us. So the first observation I would make is that when you think about the data that you use to make important decisions in this moment, that there are three kinds of indicators you need to be thinking about, paying attention to. So the first are lagging indicators. So they're data, they're often great data, but they are they're nothing you can change. So a lagging indicator is a fact. It's and unfortunately, most of the information that we use in business to make decisions are lagging indicators. So most of our financial metrics are lagging. They're today's results of past decisions, right? So they're useful, but they're not particularly useful for seeing into the future. Then we have current indicators. They kind of tell you where you are. So things like net promoter scores or employee engagement would be examples where they're sort of giving you a snapshot of what's going on right now. And again, useful, but not particularly helpful when you're looking at the future. And finally, we have leading indicators. And these are the most important when you're trying to think about what's likely to be going on in a future state. Now, a couple of points about leading indicators that make them a little tricky to work with. The first point is that by definition, they're about things that haven't happened yet. So reasonable people can disagree about what they might mean. Secondly, you shouldn't judge the benefit of monitoring a leading indicator by whether it was predictive. In other words, as long as it encouraged a sense of preparedness, it was useful. So a great example of this is back in the 90s, right? Computer scientists figured out that systems all over the world had been programmed with only 2 digits for the year because it saved on scarce storage space. And the predictions were dire because the year 2000 was approaching, and the premise was that computers all over the world would think it was 1900, and it was dire, right? Airplanes were going to drop out of the sky, and nuclear plants were going to become unstable, and we should all move to Montana and stockpile wheat. I mean, that was the gravity of the predictions that were being made. So the big moment happens, the year 2000 occurs. What happens? Nothing happens. But why did nothing happen? Nothing happened because we took the warning, we took the leading indicator seriously. And I think there are many parallels in that scenario to the current pandemic situation. Many people had predicted something like this, and many people had put significant investment into being ready, and yet those efforts were dismantled. And I think that's a really interesting lesson today for the danger of ignoring a leading indicator. And leading indicators are often qualitative. There's stories about the future, which is this session, right? Headlines from the future. So what we're going to focus on is how do you develop and build an early warning system that can help you think about leading indicators rather than lagging or current ones. So this fits into what I call the early warnings model, and it kind of has a very interesting set of relationships. The first is that in the beginning of the signal that something's about to change in your world, a beginning of an inflection point, the signals are very weak, right? It's hard to really know what you should be paying attention to because it's not very strong. It's not looking you in the face, right? And then gradually you get more and more information until finally at what I call time zero, you have facts. You have data you can look at, you can take photographs, that's all great, but here's the problem. Your degrees of strategic freedom are inversely related to the quality of the information that you have to work with. And this is one of the fundamental dilemmas of the strategist, right? Which is by the time you've got the information you would like to have had to make a strategic decision, the moment has passed and it's too late. So what you need is some way of making decisions in what I call the period of optimal warning. So you want to push your decision-making premises back in time so that you can make a decision before it's too late. Now, how do we do that? So very simply, you pick a time zero event. So something that's going to happen in the future that could be quite significant for you, for your business, for your organization. And then what you do is you work backward. So before this could happen, what must I be able to observe going on in the world that would inform my perspective about where we're going? So time zero event, what would have to be true a year before, 2 years before, 6 months before, whatever your chosen time frame is. And so that's the model we're going to explore. It's in chapter 2 of the book, and I'm going to bring it to the current situation. So how do we create these time zero events, of course, is the question that you'll not necessarily ask me. And I do it very simply. There are many, many ways of doing a much deeper dive. And I would recommend you to my colleague, Amy Webb, if you're really interested in that. But I think for strategic purposes, this is a good place to start. So you pick 2 major uncertainties. You assign different values to each, and that'll give you a 2x2. And then what you can do is tell a story about that future situation, and then you're going to craft a headline. And so that's the process I'll walk you through now. So the uncertainties I'm going to use are we going to continue to have the social contract that we've had, at least in America, since the 80s, which is basically that outsized returns go to shareholders and investors, leaving very little resource for anybody else, basically, in the economic system. So increased inequality, shareholder dominance prevails or not. And the second uncertainty is what happens with the economy. Is it going to bounce back, or are we in for a long, slow kind of slog? So if you put those 2 together, what that gives you is 4 possible futures. And I'll just sort of go around the circle here. So the first one is we continue to have a massive income inequality and a prolonged global slowdown. And I just basically call that Les Miserables. I mean, that's the worst scenario of all, right? Where you've got a pervasiveness of poverty and inequality. What we know is in that scenario that there's going to be a lot of turmoil, that it makes for unstable politics when people feel that they're not included in the economic system. And we're seeing that, today. And lots of conflict over resources. So probably a pretty grim scenario. Moving on to, we've got maximizing shareholder value, but the economy kind of comes back in much of the world. And that's kind of a rinse and repeat of the last 40 years. And we'll still have high levels of inequality. We'll still have a certain amount of political tension happening. Moving to the right, we have a prolonged global slowdown and an emergence of stakeholder capitalism, similar to the post-World War II consensus. And what I think that would look like is we have a lot of grassroots protests. We see greater expansion of the global safety net. We have more taxation or even appropriation of wealth that's already been accumulated. Government takes a much larger role and newly empowered. And then the last scenario is kind of the economy really comes back strong and we move towards stakeholder capitalism. And there I think we have a return to the post-war consensus on distribution of societal wealth. Inequality shrinks, social goods made more affordable. Now, one thing I should mention at this point is I think it's really, really important, especially as people are so uncertain right now, not to confuse preferences with predictions. You know, I know which future I would prefer. That doesn't mean that I should let that skew the indicators that I'm looking for, right? So you want to be very careful not to let your own kind of preferences say, oh, this is definitely where we're going. And I've been amazed as we make our way through this pandemic at the number of pundits who are saying, oh, this is going to be awesome, right? We're going to have gender equality and racial justice. And, you know, the economy is going to bounce back in an entirely new way. And we're going to rework all these broken systems. And I'm thinking, you know, history does not suggest that happens easily. So kind of, you know, let's at least entertain alternative futures. Okay, so the next step in this whole thing is to write a headline from the future, which is going to be your time zero event. Like what would that future, what would sort of crystallize that future? So continuing with the stories. So the first scenario, maximizing shareholder value prevails, prolonged global slowdown, Les Miserables. And I think that's very fragile. You know, a headline there would be why economic inequality leads to collapse. If, you know, leadership and community doesn't kind of do something about this, we really would face a very grim scenario. Second scenario, economy bounces back, but we still impoverish vast numbers of people. And you have extreme poverty returns to America, which had been, you know, largely limited. I mean, you know, for many years. In the global slowdown, stakeholder capitalism state, I have, I call that one the rendezvous with destiny moment. This is echoing Franklin Delano Roosevelt's speech in which he advocated basically against his class. He was born into a very wealthy circumstances, but he said, no, we have a rendezvous with destiny. We're going to oppose economic tyranny and unionization and social security and many of the benefits that we take for granted were created under his watch. He also was not shy about appropriating some of the means of production from what he called economic tyranny. So this was highly unequal control of the means of production. And if we have that scenario, you know, I think you'll start to have very stern conversations about, you know, why do we have billionaires accumulating all that wealth when there's so much need elsewhere in the economy? So I call that the rendezvous with destiny scenario. And then the last scenario is kind of return to the Great Society. We really do use this crisis to rethink some of the structures in our societies and use the resources freed up to move forward with what we're doing. So moving backward, right? So what you're going to do is say, okay, at time zero, and here I'm going to use the rendezvous with destiny scenario. So I'm just doing this for one of the scenarios, but you'd want to do it for all four. So the time zero event is new political players borrow a line from FDR's playbook, outline policies that nothing less than a new American revolution against the power and privilege of the 1%, right? So that's the thing that could happen. It's plausible. If you work backward in time, what would have to be true before that could happen? So if I start with you know, thinking about, let's say that was our January 2021 kind of time zero event. And this is a very short version of this model. I mean, I was talking to people yesterday who are in the mining business and they said, well, we're looking at 6 years. I'm like, yeah, that's perfectly appropriate for what you're trying to plan for. So you develop your timeframes based on what you're trying to plan for. So if we look at now, right, we've got influential people loudly critiquing the existing system. We've got visible action by labor and stakeholders with quite a lot of public support. You've got people now, advocating for government getting much more involved in worker safety, public health. Government itself is having a bit of a moment. And you're already seeing widespread protests, particularly against systemic racial bias. And that you can see that right now. So 6 months before this could happen, you'll start to see things like structures starting to change. So lawsuits settled that many gig workers, the new economy workers, are actually employees and need to be paid as such and need to be given the benefits that employees have. You have progressives actually coalescing around a few policy decisions. Right now it's very fragmented, but if you start to see some major themes that everybody can kind of get behind, you see efforts by influential lobbyists not being met with success. Economists starting to talk about what kind of recovery we're going to have, with some saying it's not going to be L-shaped or V-shaped, it's going to be Y-shaped, where some sectors come back very strong, some sectors don't. 3 months before, obviously for the US, one of the biggest question marks is, who becomes the president in November. And let's say to get the rendezvous with destiny scenario, you pretty much have to have a Democrat win. So the elections in the US are settled in favor of progressive states. You've got the Democrats regaining influence in both houses of Congress. You've got specific legislative plans beginning to be formed to limit stock buybacks and encourage worker protection and so forth. So you get the idea. And the concept is not to have like this huge long laundry list. What you want is to focus on a few things that are likely to be leading indicators of this potential future. So I'll move towards closure and then we'll get to take some questions. I would leave you with a couple of themes. When I first started in the world of strategy, all the cool kids were doing industry analysis, right? And that was the fun thing to be doing. And topics of innovation were sort of seen as somewhat off to the side. They weren't seen as really mission critical. Today, because I think competitive advantages have gotten so short and we're dealing with so many more of these inflection points, what we're seeing is they're coming together. And increasingly, if you're going to talk about either strategy or innovation, it has a digital component to it. So I just leave that as a theme that you might want to be thinking about as you consider your own strategies going forward. So some final thoughts to take with you. Inflection points this one certainly feels as though it happened overnight. But if you think about it, people have been talking about the risk of a possible pandemic at least since the Bush administration. He was very taken with the risk. Bill Gates gave a very famous TED talk about it 5 years ago. So this isn't like it happened overnight. It was warned about and brewing for a long time. We didn't take the early warnings seriously enough. I think stories are incredibly important. It's how human beings kind of make sense of the world around us, which is why I'm saying create a headline, write a story, right? Most of us work with lagging indicators. So, kind of think about, do I just stick to lagging indicators? Am I driving with looking in the rearview mirror, or am I actually trying to see ahead of the corners? The strength of a signal is inversely related to your ability to change it. And it really isn't about prediction, but preparedness. And I'll leave you with a hopeful thought, which is you can systematically identify early warnings and get yourself ready to take action on them. So for those of you that would like to take a deeper dive, I'm on most of the social channels. My email's right there. It's very public. So I'm on Twitter, LinkedIn, YouTube. I do have a monthly newsletter in which I write. With the coronavirus crisis, my newsletter plans are in shreds like so many other people's plans. So what I'm going to be doing this year is writing about techniques that you can actually use in the midst of all the uncertainty that is represented by this pandemic. So this past month's was all about how do you do intelligent experiments. The previous one was how do you think about, how do you use some of the tools about uncertainty to get more clarity. You can sign up for those on my website. And something else I've been doing in the midst of the pandemic is every Friday, I'm trying to inject a little positivity into the conversation. And so I've been having what I call Friday fireside chats with people who I just think are super interesting, many of whom are on your program here at the ISPIM. So those are free. You're welcome to join us. They're usually at 11 o'clock Eastern, so that's a reasonable kind of time frame. Not always, but usually. But they're always on Friday, and you can find the schedule for the upcoming ones on my website. Okay, with that, Anne-Laure, I'll turn it back over to you and take some questions.
Thank you very much for sharing your insights. I'm convinced our audience has very much appreciated your views. Can I get you to elaborate a little bit first on the Great Society 2.0? What would it look like? What would be its main features?
Well, I think that would be that would evoke the kind of great post-World War II consensus, where you had, for example, in the United States, you had a group called the Committee for Economic Development, and that was a leading group of business people. And it wasn't uncontroversial, but they basically said, look, if we're going to have renewed society, what we need to really focus on is jobs. And we've got and they calculated that they would need 58 million new American jobs, and the state of the economy at the time could only support about half that many. So you had all the soldiers coming back from World War II, and the economy was at risk of going back into a major depression if they didn't have jobs. So corporate leaders made a very clear, very conscious calculation to give up some of their profits and profitability in order to provide decent wages, to give unions a say in what would happen, to create essentially the American middle class that powered the economy throughout the 50s, 60s, 70s. And that was a consensus that really started to erode, I would say, back to the Reagan administration, when, a lot of shocks hit the economy. You had the first true impact of globalization, when trade really did go global, and you had these wage disparities, which meant you could have labor arbitrage, and a lot of jobs were sent overseas, and and getting us to the situation we have now, where essentially the American middle class has been largely eliminated. The most of the jobs in this country are not very good jobs. So I think what it would look like is a return to that sort of consensus that resources need to be more broadly shared. And this is a policy choice. I mean, God did not come down and say, this is how you're going to share out your profits. Another stunning statistic that really I thought was very scary was, if you look at the distribution of profits for a typical company in 1960, 11% of the profits went to, let me just see if I got this right, something like 11% of the profits went to workers, R&D, stuff like that. And something like 6% went to investors and executives. And that today has been completely flipped. And there's a lot of evidence also that private companies, which do have a much longer term view, and of course they don't have public shareholders howling at them, but that they invest far more in long-term investments. So research, R&D, worker health, and so forth. And so a lot of what I've been looking at right now is, what would it take to return to what Bill Lazonick calls a reinvest, retain earnings and reinvest in your own organization. Because the other thing that's happened is the quality of jobs has really gone down in many cases. So, back in the day, it was thought, and by the way, this was a very conscious bargain that the people in the Committee for Economic Development made. They said, what we want is workers who give us loyalty and invest their intelligence, their ingenuity, their well-being in the long-term interest of the firm. So we want employees who are going to stick around for a while, and we're going to make it possible for them to do that. Whereas today, what you got is workers who just jump from job to job to job, company to company to company. And the risk of that is that if you think of what creates a competitive advantage, if you can buy something on an open market, it can't be a competitive advantage for you. So you've got to create something that is idiosyncratic, that's hard to copy, that other people can't just obtain, or you're just buying on a market like anybody else, and your returns are going to be driven to commodity prices.
Absolutely, and I'm sure taking a more humanistic perspective would certainly help the world as a general thought to that.
I mean, I don't want this to be misread as some sort of, liberal pipe dream. What we learn is when you give people decent amounts of money, they can actually buy goods and services. That creates customers. That creates a healthy economy. I mean, this is, if you give all the profits to a billionaire and that billionaire buys 2 pairs of pants, well, that's great. But if you shared that money among 10,000 people and they buy 10,000 pairs of pants, that's a much more robust economy.
Yes, there's a much larger redistribution. We've got quite a few questions popping up, and actually quite some focus on how to implement that and how to systematically detect early warnings, and what kind of tools, methods, toolkits can be used to achieve that.
Where did you want me to start? That's a very broad question.
It is.
Well, you know, to do the early warnings, really, it just requires allocation of time on your calendar. I think that's where it starts. And I can do a workshop like this in, you know, 2-3 hours. It doesn't take, I mean, it doesn't have to take endless amounts of effort. I mean, it can, you know, if you really want to do a thorough job and you're going to be making, you know, 30, 40-year decisions on the basis of what you find, then it's probably worth taking more time. But I think the first thing is you do a workshop. I think about what could some of these leading indicators look like, and then go through the 2x2 exercise, and then really put some creativity into working backward. A couple of additional points on that is if you look at companies and where they get their information from, what you find is often that the information you need is what I call the edges of the organization. So it's people that are talking to customers, people that are actually delivering your business. And oftentimes those people don't have a voice in the strategy discussions. So one of the things I really encourage people to do, and this is in my book as well, is get out to the edges, because that's where, what I like to say is, snow melts from the edges. You know, that's where things are most exposed. So, you know, what I recommend as you're monitoring these early warnings is create something like what Stanley McChrystal created in Afghanistan, which is this sort of horizontal participation across the whole organization, where you're just to say, what are you seeing? What are you seeing? What are you seeing? Because when I look at companies that have gotten an inflection point wrong, almost always somebody knew. People knew in the organization. It wasn't a mystery. And yet it never penetrated to the level where strategic decisions got made.
We've got a few questions around digital technologies and the use of big data. And one of them is actually asking us, to what extent do you think that the current attention to big data actually undermines our search for useful leading indicators? We'd like your view on that.
Sure. So if you look at AI or machine learning or some of these things that get talked about a lot, what people have to remember is that AI, you know, artificial intelligence, is only as good as the data sets it's trained on. And by definition, the data sets they're trained on are lagging indicators, right? So I think it's a mistake to over rely on something that is basically looking backward. So that's the first observation I would make. Second thing I would say is what big data has done is it's allowed us to change the way that we interrogate the world. So in the old days, you would, let's say you were doing marketing studies, you would formulate a hypothesis, and then you would create some mechanism to obtain data. So, you know, you'd do a survey, or you'd do a conjoint analysis or whatever. Today, what you can do is you can articulate a hypothesis and then go fishing for the data. This is a phrase my friend Oded Netzer uses a lot, because the data likely exists out there somewhere. But what you have to do is create the question, like, what are you trying to solve for? And the big problem with big data is not typically finding the talent to do the analysis or crunch the numbers. It's how do you construct a meaningful hypothesis that you then want to test?
Yes, you can get the data to tell whatever you want, whatever story you want them to tell, but this is maybe not the point. We have a lot of ISPIM delegates coming from Europe, so I'd like to bring the conversation to what's your view on the future in Europe, and how Europe is positioning itself in the recovery and regrowth phase, building on the Green Deal, and also on the massive post-COVID-19 strategy that the European Commission is implementing. And to what extent do you think that this might help to build a more desirable future?
Mm-hmm. I think when you look at Europe, a couple of things. I think you've got some really great leaders in Europe that are actually thinking the way that the Committee on Economic Development thought. They're not just thinking about how do I look good today, they're thinking about how do I build some robust structures. The other thing you've got in Europe is some really interesting examples of this kind of willingness to have more broadly shared prosperity. I mean, I was just recently in Finland virtually, and what they've done in Finland is, I said, you know, there's a robust role for government, and let's not make business handle a lot of these social concerns. And so things like education, healthcare, daycare, and, you know, those kinds of things, government actually has a legitimate role to play. So I think you've got some really interesting examples in Europe of how you can build a more just society.
Very good. Well, Finland is known as the happy country, so there has to be good reasons for that. Well, unfortunately, we have to draw this to a close today. It's been an absolute pleasure to host you with us within the ISPIM conference, virtual conference. And on behalf of the over 150 participants, I would like to thank you very much for sharing your thoughts with us today.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.